Thank you, Scott. Can you all hear me in the back? Just raise your hand if you can hear me in the back of the room so I know. Okay. I'm J.P. Parker, and I want to thank Congressman Pittenger. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, sir. This is a very important forum. I'm honored to be here and share my perspective with you. I recently retired from the federal government. I was the intelligence community space executive. It was a new office, stood up to help organize our intelligence community's space assets. So it won't be any surprise to you that the United States not only operates a Defense Department fleet of satellites, but the intelligence community provides a very vital function to our nation by operating our eyes and ears in space. So we observe things on the ground from space, and we listen to things that are transpiring on the ground in space, and we move a lot of data in space. And the intelligence community is, in my opinion, a co-equal partner of the Department of Defense in providing an integrated intelligence and defense suite of capabilities to protect the United States' interests. I also served at the White House when Scott was there on the Space Council, and we were part of the team that took the Vice President and President's direction to reconstitute the National Space Council and make it a priority for the United States going forward, that space would not be done as an afterthought, but would be done as a central element of national power, unifying three disparate areas that had been somewhat operating independently: national security space, commercial space, and civilian space, to include NASA and its science and exploration missions. And I think the National Space Council is a huge success for the United States in terms of policy and moving forward, and Scott gets a lot of the credit, as does Steve, who was also one of the instrumental members in standing up the Space Force when he was at the Department of Defense. I'm honored to be with them here today. Let me give you my bottom line up front, and I'll come back to this at the end of my remarks, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it through questions and answers. I thought about how I would address international dignitaries and parliamentarians and what I would say about space, since I come from the part that we don't often get to talk to foreigners about, which is our intelligence community space posture. But what I will tell you is this: having spent most of the last decade reflecting on what our adversaries intend to do in the future, especially if conflict with the United States and its allies should occur, is they will understand, and they have come to know, that our space-based dominance gives us a huge advantage. It advantages us economically as well as in the national security realm, and they intend to negate that in the future. One of the things, and we can talk more about other things that we can do, but one of the things that I think will keep the Chinese and Russian military planners up at night will be how to confront an international alliance of like-minded spacefaring countries that both have national space capabilities as well as a robust commercial set of space capabilities, because that's what the future holds in store. And being together as an alliance will be one of the most vexing problems adversaries will challenge them as they plan to basically remove our dominance in space. Today, for those who are not tracking it, is December 7th, and that has special significance here in the United States. This is the commemoration of what we call Pearl Harbor Day. So 81 years ago, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval fleet in Hawaii, and that began our entrance into World War II. But it was done in a way that was shocking to us because it was a surprise attack on us that we did not see coming. And so the United States Navy and its fleet at Pearl Harbor were caught off guard, and we were severely damaged in terms of our military capability by the surprise nature of that attack. What a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about now and in the future is what a Pearl Harbor in space would look like. And I think that's one of the concepts that has been floating around in the academic and policy circles for some time. Are we becoming so dependent on space that any kind of an unforeseen occurrence in space would have dramatic consequences? And so the idea, coincident to today being Pearl Harbor Day, is making sure we have no Pearl Harbors in space. So does anybody here in this room have a space-enabled device for computing and communication? Anybody raise their hand? Nobody has a smartphone in this room. This is a space-enabled computing and network device. If you take away the space dependency of this phone, it becomes less of a smartphone and more of a dumb phone. So a lot of people don't realize the dependency we, not just in the national security realm, but in civil society, rely on space. Your GPS receiver in your phone enables all sorts of applications that you've come to rely on a day-to-day basis. You want to check the weather? Where's that data coming from? You ever seen the satellite imagery that shows up in your weather app? Obviously, you rely on space for that. Your ability to communicate over disparate communication networks, different cell providers all around the globe, pick up the phone, call your friend wherever they are in the globe, that relies on coordinating activities that take place relying on space-based infrastructure. There's very many obvious things we can think of that rely on space, but what's becoming more important over time is the non-obvious things that are becoming more and more dependent on space. Our transportation systems, not just the national security part, but our civilian transport of goods and services around the world, it relies on space. Long-haul communications rely on space. The idea that you would remove space for a day and see what impacts it would have on society is a kind of a scary thought. We've run simulations and we've done war games and analytic exercises to find out what a day without space would be. And I can tell you, without getting into classified information, things get very ugly very quickly in civilized life if you don't have access to space. The best estimate I have seen is that 1/4 of the US economy, goods, services, all the sectors of the US economy, 1/4 of that total GDP has some reliance on access to space-based services and capabilities. If you think about the GPS receiver in this phone and you think about all the devices that are GPS enabled, I've looked for data to see if there's an authoritative number for how many devices on planet Earth rely on GPS on a day-to-day basis. I haven't seen anything credible because no one has figured out a methodology to precisely enumerate the billions of devices that we now believe on Earth are GPS enabled. Cars, trains, fleets of equipment. There's now GPS-enabled refrigerators. It's become ubiquitous, and it all relies on unfettered access to space. So Scott mentioned some of the threats, and we have been, as Scott said, operating in space as it were a sanctuary because there weren't a lot of capabilities to challenge America's space supremacy for many, many years. But the United States intelligence community has begun publishing in unclassified forums, along with the Department of Defense, some of what we know the threats in space to be. And I would refer you to a Google search to the Department of Defense. You could look for challenges to space, publications that have been put out, and my former boss, the Director of National Intelligence, has also testified publicly about space. But what I will tell you in this unclassified setting is this, and this is the assessment of the United States intelligence community. Beijing intends to erode U.S. influence across military, economic, and diplomatic spheres. And China and Russia have created space forces and are pursuing an entire range of weapons and capabilities to degrade, disrupt, and defeat the U.S. and its allies in space should conflict arise. We began tracking Chinese space activities in earnest almost 20 years ago when they had a very nascent program. Most of what China had in the space program 20 years ago were scientific satellites, communication satellites, and what we would consider to be very rudimentary intelligence-related satellites. The growth over the last 15 to 20 years in China's space forces and counter-space capabilities has been unparalleled. The rate of progress, numerically and qualitatively, is like nothing any nation has ever achieved. They have put themselves as a nation forward with a unified national requirement to become a leader in space, to challenge U.S. supremacy, and ultimately exceed the U.S. capabilities wherever possible. And that's been underway for 15 or 20 years. Scott mentioned the destruction of a Chinese satellite by their anti-satellite missile in 2007. That was not only a demonstration of capability that they had at that time, it was also a message to the U.S. and the rest of the world. Your space assets are at risk, and we have the capability to take them out if we need to. It was as much a message as it was a demonstration of capability. The Russians joined that club just last year, as Scott mentioned. For those who are, what's that? Rejoined the club last year, good point. And the Russians destroyed one of their satellites late last year in a display that we consider to be reckless and unprofessional. I mentioned the Chinese ASAT test. About a third of all debris being tracked around the world in low Earth orbit is the result of that one test in 2007. Created a debris field that we are still dealing with and will be for years to come. The Russian ASAT test that took place this past year The space station, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, is conducting maneuvers to avoid the debris that they created by that reckless test. Again, a demonstration of capability and also a message to the United States and its allies. You're dependent on space, your economy, your national security all rely on it, and we have the ability to damage, degrade, and disrupt that if we want. So simply put, we've done war games, we've done analysis, we've looked at how we, the United States and our allies, have become dependent on space and how our adversaries are seeking to challenge that. And the bottom line when it comes to conflict is this. If you lose your space capabilities, you could expect to potentially not prevail in a conflict against a peer adversary. So the challenge will be not only protecting our capabilities in space, but making sure our adversaries cannot use their offensive capabilities against us. It matters not only from a military standpoint, but it matters economically, as I've described earlier. So let me just come back to my bottom line, and I'll wrap up, and we can move on to Steve, and then hopefully we'll have a time for some dialogue and questions and answers. The bottom line, there are several things that keep the Chinese war planners up at night. One of those things will be, what is it they don't know about what we are doing with our allies, and what capabilities have we managed to keep secret? The other thing that will keep them up at night is the mere fact that we are engaged in a global alliance with like-minded nations who also rely on space, have space as a future requirement for their citizenry and their way of life, and are willing to work together to frustrate adversaries' ambitions to deny us space. The global alliance, which I'm hoping will only expand in the future, starts with things like a moratorium on anti-satellite missile testing. Many nations have jumped on board now this year that the United States has declared we will no longer conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests. I don't know the current number of nations, but many nations are jumping on board with that moratorium also. More than just having military alliances and diplomatic alliances, it will be important to have a vibrant and robust commercial space capability. The economies depend on it. It's projected that the space economy will be $1 trillion by the end of this decade. If you look at the dependence on your GDP to space and what space business will do for your GDP, it's important you have commercial as well as national security capabilities in space. And then the alliance will rely on not just national security capabilities, but commercial alliances that will help frustrate adversaries' intentions to remove our dominance in space. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Steve Katay.